The afternoon sun was beating down on Oak Street when Detective Ray Coleman spotted the black sedan cruising through the quiet neighborhood. He'd been having a rough day, dealing with paperwork and complaints from his supervisor about his recent reports. When he saw the car pass by what he thought was a bit too fast, he decided this was his chance to make something happen. Coleman flipped on his patrol car's lights and pulled the sedan over near the corner of Oak and Pine. Behind the wheel sat Agent Lisa Thompson, a dedicated FBI investigator who had just finished one of the most challenging months of her career. She'd been working deep undercover, infiltrating a dangerous criminal organization that had been trafficking illegal goods across state lines. The operation had finally wrapped up successfully, and she was driving home to her small apartment looking forward to a hot shower and some much-needed rest. Lisa was dressed in casual clothes, faded jeans, a comfortable hoodie, and worn sneakers. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she looked nothing like the polished federal agent she was during her regular duties. After weeks of maintaining her cover identity, she was simply ready to be herself again. When she saw the police lights in her rearview mirror, Lisa pulled over calmly and turned off her engine. She placed both hands on the steering wheel, just as she'd been trained to do during her law enforcement education. Having worked with police officers throughout her career, she knew the proper procedure and expected this would be a routine interaction. Coleman stepped out of his patrol car with an attitude that had been building all day. He was a 15-year veteran of the force, but his approach to policing had become increasingly problematic over the years. He walked up to the driver's side window with heavy steps, his hand resting on his duty belt, in a way that suggested he was already expecting trouble. "License and registration," Coleman barked without any greeting or explanation of why he'd made the stop. His tone was harsh and demanding, nothing like the professional courtesy that should mark police interactions with the public. Lisa looked up at him through her partially rolled down window. "Good afternoon, officer. May I ask why you pulled me over?" Her voice was calm and respectful, the tone of someone who understood how these situations should work. Coleman's jaw tightened. He didn't like being questioned, especially not by someone he'd already decided was probably up to no good. "I said license and registration. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "I understand, officer, but I have the right to know the reason for the stop," Lisa replied, still maintaining her professional composure. "I was following all traffic laws as far as I know." This response only made Coleman angrier. In his mind, her calm questioning wasn't the behavior of a respectful citizen. It was attitude, and he wasn't going to tolerate it. "Step out of the vehicle, now." Lisa felt her heart rate increase slightly. This wasn't following normal protocol, and her training kicked in. Something wasn't right about this situation. "Officer, I'd prefer to handle this from inside my vehicle. Could you please tell me your badge number and explain why you need me to exit the car?" Coleman's face reddened. He'd dealt with what he considered difficult people before, and he wasn't in the mood for what he saw as disrespect. "I'm not asking again. Get out of the car or I'll remove you myself." Lisa knew she had to be very careful. She could see that this officer was escalating a simple traffic stop for no apparent reason. She decided to try a different approach. "Officer, I'm going to reach for my purse to get my identification. I'm telling you this so you know what I'm doing." She slowly moved her hand toward her purse, which was sitting on the passenger seat. This simple movement seemed to trigger something in Coleman's mind. His weeks of built-up frustration, combined with his tendency to see threats where none existed, made him react in the worst possible way. "Don't reach for anything," Coleman shouted, yanking open her car door. "I said get out." Lisa tried to remain calm even as the situation spiraled out of control. "Officer, please calm down. I'm not reaching for anything dangerous. I'm just trying to get my identification like you asked." But Coleman was beyond listening to reason. He grabbed Lisa's arm and pulled her from the vehicle with unnecessary force. She stumbled as she was yanked from her seat, catching herself against the side of the car. "I need to see your identification," she said, trying to de-escalate the situation while standing beside her car. "This is not proper procedure for a traffic stop." Coleman interpreted her continued calm responses as defiance. In his mind, she should have been apologetic and submissive, not questioning his methods or asking for his identification. His anger reached a boiling point. "You think you can tell me how to do my job?" Coleman snapped. "You people always think you know better than the police." Lisa felt a chill at those words. She recognized the underlying prejudice in his tone, something she'd unfortunately encountered before in her line of work. But she maintained her professional demeanor, knowing that staying calm was her best strategy. "Officer, I'm going to reach into my jacket pocket to show you my credentials," she said clearly, moving very slowly. "I'm a federal law enforcement officer." Coleman saw her reaching toward her jacket and made a split-second decision that would change both of their lives forever. Instead of allowing her to show her identification, instead of following proper protocol, instead of using any of the de-escalation techniques he'd been trained on, he let his anger and prejudice take control. His hand came across her face with a sharp crack that echoed off the nearby houses. Lisa's head snapped to the side from the impact, and she tasted blood immediately as her lips split from the force of the blow. For a moment, everything went quiet, except for the sound of Lisa's breathing and the distant hum of traffic from the main road. She stood there, one hand pressed to her bleeding lip, looking at Coleman with a mixture of shock and determination. Coleman realized immediately that he'd crossed a line, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Maybe that'll teach you some respect," he muttered, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Lisa slowly reached into her jacket pocket, her movements deliberate and careful. Her hand closed around the leather wallet that contained her federal credentials, the badge and identification that would turn this entire situation upside down. The quiet neighborhood street was about to become the center of a storm that would shake the entire police department and change both of their lives in ways neither could have imagined. What had started as a simple traffic stop was about to become a case study in what happens when prejudice and poor judgment collide with federal law enforcement. Lisa stood there for a moment, her hand pressed against her bleeding lip, tasting the metallic flavor of blood in her mouth. The sting from Coleman's slap was sharp, but the shock of what had just happened was even stronger. In all her years of law enforcement training and field work, she had never been struck by a fellow officer. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent weeks undercover with dangerous criminals who had treated her with more respect than this police officer. Coleman stood a few feet away, his chest rising and falling heavily. Part of him felt satisfied that he'd put this woman in what he thought was her place, but another part of him was starting to realize he might have gone too far. Still, his pride wouldn't let him show any weakness or admit he'd made a mistake. Lisa took a deep breath and slowly reached into her jacket pocket. Her movements were deliberate and careful, knowing that any sudden motion could make this volatile situation even worse. Coleman watched her suspiciously, his hand still hovering near his weapon. "I'm reaching for my identification," Lisa said, clearly, her voice steady despite the pain in her lip. "Please don't make any sudden movements." Her fingers closed around the familiar leather wallet that had been her companion for the past 8 years of federal service. The weight of it felt heavier than usual as she pulled it from her pocket, knowing that everything was about to change. Coleman's eyes narrowed as he watched her withdraw what looked like a standard wallet. "About time you decided to cooperate," he muttered, though something in her calm demeanor was starting to make him uneasy. Lisa flipped open the wallet with a practiced motion, revealing the gold badge that caught the afternoon sunlight. The eagle at the top gleamed, and the words, "Federal Bureau of Investigation," were clearly visible across the top of the shield. Below it, her official identification card showed her photograph and rank. Coleman's eyes went wide as he read the badge. His mouth opened slightly, and for a moment, no words came out. The color drained from his face as the reality of what he was seeing hit him like a freight train. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," Lisa said quietly, holding the badge steady so he could read every word. "Special Agent Lisa Thompson, badge number 2847. Coleman felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. His mind raced as he tried to process what this meant. He'd just struck a federal agent, not just any federal agent, but an FBI investigator. The very people who investigated police misconduct and civil rights violations. That's not possible," Coleman stammered, his earlier confidence completely gone. You don't look like... Like what? Lisa asked, raising an eyebrow despite the pain from her split lip. Like a federal agent? What exactly does a federal agent look like to you, Officer Coleman? She'd read his name badge during their confrontation, and using his name now made the situation feel even more personal and serious. Coleman's hands began to shake slightly as the full weight of his actions started to sink in. I didn't know, Coleman said weakly, though they both knew that wasn't an excuse for his behavior. You should have told me right away. Lisa kept, her badge visible as she spoke. I tried to show you my credentials. You decided to strike me instead of following proper procedure. You assaulted a federal officer, Officer Coleman. Coleman's mind was spinning. He thought about his pension, his job, his family. Everything he'd worked for over 15 years was crashing down around him because of one moment of poor judgment and prejudice. Look, maybe we can work this out, Coleman said desperately, his voice taking on a pleading tone. It was just a misunderstanding. I thought you were being difficult and I reacted poorly. We can forget this whole thing happened. Lisa closed her badge wallet and put it back in her pocket, but kept her official identification card visible. Officer Coleman, you just asked a federal agent to cover up a crime. That's another felony you're trying to add to your list. Coleman felt panic rising in his chest. Please, I have a family. I've got kids in college. This job is all I know. I made a mistake, but we can handle this between us, right? Lisa shook her head slowly. The time for handling this quietly passed the moment you decided to use force against someone who was cooperating with a traffic stop. I need you to step back while I make some phone calls. She reached into her other pocket and pulled out a secure communication device that looked different from a regular cell phone. Coleman recognized it as the type of equipment federal agents used for official communications. What are you doing? Coleman asked, though he already knew the answer. I'm calling for federal backup and requesting medical attention for my injuries, Lisa replied matter-of-factly. I'm also reporting an assault on a federal officer to my supervisors. Coleman watched in horror as Lisa pressed a few buttons on the device. When someone answered, her voice became crisp and professional. This is Special Agent Thompson, badge 2847. I need immediate federal response to Oak Street and Pine Avenue. I've been assaulted by a local police officer during what started as a traffic stop. I have injuries that need medical attention, and I need investigators on scene immediately. The voice on the other end asked several questions, and Lisa provided clear, factual answers about what had happened. Coleman could hear the concern in the federal dispatcher's voice even from several feet away. ETA is 12 minutes for first responders, 8 minutes for medical, Lisa reported after ending the call. She then made another call, this one to local police dispatch. This is FBI Special Agent Lisa Thompson. I need to speak with the watch commander immediately. One of your officers has just committed a federal crime, and I need supervisory personnel on scene right away. Coleman felt, his legs getting weak. This was really happening. There was no talking his way out of it, no making it disappear. Within minutes, his entire career and life were going to change forever. Agent Thompson, Coleman said quietly, using her title for the first time. I know I messed up badly. Is there anything at all I can do to make this right? Lisa looked at him with a mixture of sadness and determination. Officer Coleman, you had multiple chances to de-escalate this situation. You could have treated me with basic human respect. You could have followed proper procedure. Instead, you chose to use violence against someone who was complying with your requests. The time for making this right was before you decided to hit me. In the distance, they could both hear the sound of sirens approaching, multiple vehicles coming from different directions. Coleman's radio crackled to life with urgent chatter about federal agents responding to his location. Lisa touched her lip gently, feeling the swelling that was already starting. She thought about all the training sessions she'd attended about police community relations, all the times she'd worked alongside professional law enforcement officers who treated everyone with dignity and respect. This incident was going to be a stain on all of their reputations. Coleman stood there watching his career and future disappear with each passing second as the sirens grew louder. He finally understood that his actions had consequences he never could have imagined when he decided to let his prejudices and anger control his behavior on this quiet suburban street. The first federal vehicle arrived exactly 8 minutes after Lisa's call, its tires screeching slightly as it pulled up behind Coleman's patrol car. Agent Mike Rodriguez jumped out before the car had completely stopped, his trained eyes immediately assessing the scene. He could see Lisa standing near her sedan, a tissue pressed to her lip, while Coleman stood several feet away looking like he'd seen a ghost. Right behind Rodriguez came the medical unit, followed quickly by 2 more FBI vehicles. The quiet residential street suddenly looked like something from a crime scene television show, with flashing lights reflecting off the windows of nearby houses. Neighbors began peering out from behind curtains, wondering what could possibly be happening in their peaceful neighborhood. Rodriguez approached Lisa first, his face showing concern as he noticed the blood on the tissue she was holding. "Agent Thompson, what's your status?" "I'm okay, Mike," Lisa replied, though her voice was slightly strained. "Split lip, some swelling. Nothing that won't heal. But we need to process this scene carefully. Everything happened right here." The paramedic, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, gently examined Lisa's injuries. "The cut isn't deep enough for stitches, but you're going to have some swelling and bruising. We should take photos of the injuries for evidence." Meanwhile, Coleman watched this professional response unfold and felt increasingly sick to his stomach. These weren't just random federal agents. They knew Lisa personally, they cared about her welfare, and they were treating this as a serious federal crime scene. Agent Rodriguez walked over to Coleman, his expression stern but controlled. "Officer Coleman, I'm Agent Rodriguez with the FBI. I need you to understand that you're now part of a federal investigation. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court." Coleman's radio crackled again, and this time it was his own supervisor. "Unit 47, what's your status? We're getting reports of federal agents at your location." Before Coleman could respond, a marked police supervisor's car pulled up with lights flashing. Captain Torres stepped out, a man who'd been with the department for 25 years and had seen his share of difficult situations. But as he took in the scene, the FBI agents, the medical personnel, and his officer standing there looking defeated, he knew this was going to be unlike anything he'd dealt with before. "Agent Rodriguez," Captain Torres said, extending his hand in greeting. "I'm Captain Torres, Officer Coleman's supervisor. I came as soon as we heard federal agents. We're responding to this location." Rodriguez shook his hand, but his expression remained serious. "Captain, your officer assaulted one of our agents during what should have been a routine traffic stop. Agent Thompson was struck in the face without provocation." Captain Torres felt his heart sink. He looked at Coleman, hoping for some explanation that would make this less serious than it sounded. "Ray, is this true?" Coleman couldn't meet his supervisor's eyes. "Captain, it was a misunderstanding. I didn't know she was FBI. She was asking questions and I thought she was being difficult." "Stop talking, Ray," Captain Torres said quickly, recognizing that Coleman was only making things worse for himself. "Don't say another word without a lawyer present." But the damage was already being done in other ways. Agent Patricia Kim, who specialized in federal investigations of police misconduct, had arrived and was beginning to collect evidence. She photographed Lisa's injuries from multiple angles, documented the scene, and started interviewing potential witnesses. Mrs. Chen, who lived in the house directly across from where the incident occurred, had seen the entire confrontation from her kitchen window. "I was washing dishes when I heard the officer yelling," she told Agent Kim. The woman was very calm, very polite. She never raised her voice or acted aggressively. When he hit her, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Agent Kim made careful notes of everything Mrs. Chen said. This wasn't just going to be a case of one person's word against another. There were witnesses and likely security camera footage from the neighborhood. As if reading her thoughts, Agent Kim noticed the small security camera mounted under the eaves of the house on the corner. "Agent Rodriguez, we need to secure that camera footage immediately." Within an hour, the FBI team had identified 3 different security cameras that had captured portions of the incident. The footage was clear and damning, showing Coleman's aggressive approach, Lisa's calm compliance, and the moment when he struck her without any justification. While the evidence was being collected, Lisa was giving her formal statement to Agent Rodriguez. Her account was precise and professional, focusing on facts rather than emotions. Officer Coleman approached my vehicle in an aggressive manner from the beginning. When I asked for the reason for the stop and requested his badge number, he became increasingly hostile. I informed him multiple times that I was reaching for my identification, but he chose to use physical force instead of allowing me to produce my credentials. Captain Torres, meanwhile, was on his radio with the police chief, trying to explain a situation that seemed to get worse with every passing minute. "Chief, we've got a major problem here. Coleman struck an FBI agent during a traffic stop. The feds are treating this as a federal crime scene." The police chief's voice came back tight with stress. "How bad is this, Torres?" "It's about as bad as it gets, Chief. They've got witnesses, camera footage, and medical evidence. This isn't going away quietly." Back at the scene, Agent Kim was discovering something that made the situation even more serious. While running Coleman's name through federal databases, she found something troubling. "Agent Rodriguez, you need to see this. Coleman has had multiple complaints filed against him over the past 5 years. 3 of them specifically mention excessive force and discriminatory behavior." Rodriguez reviewed the information on Kim's tablet. "This shows a pattern of behavior. These complaints were all filed with the local police department's Internal Affairs Division. What happened to the investigations?" Captain Torres, overhearing this conversation, felt another wave of dread wash over him. He knew exactly what had happened to those complaints. They'd been minimized, dismissed, or buried in paperwork. The department's internal review process had failed to address Coleman's problematic behavior, and now it was coming back to haunt them in the worst possible way. "Captain," Agent Rodriguez said, "we're going to need access to Officer Coleman's complete personnel file, including all complaint investigations and disciplinary actions. This is now a federal civil rights investigation." The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about one officer's bad decision. It was about a police department that had failed to address a pattern of misconduct, allowing Coleman to continue working despite multiple red flags. Lisa, having completed her statement and received medical clearance, approached Captain Torres. Despite everything that had happened, her tone remained professional. "Captain, I want you to know that I don't hold your entire department responsible for Officer Coleman's actions. But the federal investigation is going to examine why his previous behavior wasn't addressed properly." Captain Torres nodded gravely. He'd been a cop long enough to know that this incident was going to trigger a comprehensive review of the department's policies and procedures. Heads were going to roll, careers were going to end, and the entire police force was going to be under federal scrutiny. As the afternoon wore on and more federal investigators arrived, Coleman sat in the back of Agent Rodriguez's vehicle, handcuffed and facing the reality that his 15-year career in law enforcement was over. More than that, he was looking at serious federal criminal charges that could result in years in prison. The quiet residential street had become the center of a storm that would ultimately reshape how the entire police department operated, all because one officer had let his prejudices and poor judgment override his training and basic human decency. 3 weeks after the incident on Oak Street, Coleman sat in a sterile federal courthouse room, his hands folded tightly in his lap as his attorney, David Walsh, reviewed the charges one more time. The list was longer and more serious than Coleman had ever imagined possible when he'd started his shift that fateful afternoon. "Ray, I need you to understand what we're facing here," Walsh said quietly, adjusting his glasses as he read from the federal indictment. "Assault on a federal officer, violation of civil rights under color of law, and deprivation of rights under the 14th Amendment. The prosecution has video evidence, witness testimony, and medical documentation. This isn't a case we can fight on the facts." Coleman's wife, Janet, sat beside him with red-rimmed eyes. She'd barely slept since the arrest, worrying about their mortgage, their kids' college tuition, and how they'd survive if Ray went to prison. "David, isn't there anything we can do? Ray made a mistake, but he's not a bad person. He's been a police officer for 15 years. Walsh shook his head sadly. "The federal prosecutors aren't interested in his years of service. They're interested in the pattern of behavior that led to this incident. They have documentation of 3 previous complaints against Ray that were never properly investigated by the police department. Meanwhile, across town in the federal building, Assistant U.S. Attorney Maria Santos was preparing her case with the thoroughness that had made her one of the most respected prosecutors in the district. She spread the evidence across her conference table like pieces of a puzzle that told a clear and disturbing story. The security camera footage was the centerpiece of her case. The video showed Coleman's aggressive approach from the very beginning, Lisa's calm and cooperative responses, and the unprovoked assault that followed. But Santos knew the case was about more than just one incident. This isn't just about Officer Coleman hitting Agent Thompson, Santos explained to her team. This is about a police department that failed to address a pattern of misconduct that led inevitably to this moment. We have 3 separate civilians who filed complaints about Coleman's behavior over the past 5 years, and all 3 complaints were either dismissed or inadequately investigated. The first complainant was Robert Johnson, a college student, who'd been pulled over 2 years earlier. Coleman had used excessive force during the arrest, leaving Johnson with bruises and a dislocated shoulder. The police department's internal investigation had concluded that Coleman's actions were within policy guidelines, despite witness statements that contradicted Coleman's report. The second complaint came from Maria Gonzalez, a nurse who'd been stopped while driving home from a late shift at the hospital. Coleman had made inappropriate comments about her appearance and had detained her for over an hour without cause, searching her car and making her feel humiliated and violated. The internal review had resulted in nothing more than a verbal counseling session that wasn't even documented in Coleman's personnel file. The third complaint was the most serious. Frank Williams, a local business owner, had been arrested by Coleman during a traffic stop that escalated when Williams questioned why he was being pulled over. Coleman had used his taser unnecessarily and had been caught on another officer's body camera making racially charged comments. That complaint had been buried so deep in bureaucratic paperwork that it had never reached anyone with the authority to take meaningful action. Santos knew that these previous incidents would be crucial to her case. They showed that Coleman's assault on Lisa wasn't an isolated moment of poor judgment. It was the predictable result of a pattern of behavior that had been allowed to continue unchecked. Back at the police department, the fallout was spreading like wildfire through every level of the organization. Chief Williams had been forced to place Captain Torres on administrative leave, pending a full investigation into how Coleman's previous complaints had been handled. The department's Internal Affairs Division was being scrutinized by federal investigators, who were finding systematic failures in how misconduct complaints were processed. Detective Angela Foster, who had worked alongside Coleman for several years, was struggling with the revelations about her former colleague. "I knew Ray could be rough around the edges," she told the federal investigators during her interview, "but I never saw him cross the line like this. Maybe I should have paid more attention to the complaints from the community." The federal investigation was uncovering a culture within the police department that had prioritized protecting officers over addressing legitimate complaints from the public. Supervisor reports showed a pattern of complaints being dismissed as unfounded or exaggerated, without thorough investigation. Training records revealed that Coleman had missed several mandatory sessions on de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. Lisa, meanwhile, had returned to her regular FBI duties but found herself thrust into an unexpected role as an advocate for police reform. She'd received dozens of calls from community members who had similar experiences with problematic officers, but had never felt their complaints would be taken seriously. "Agent Thompson," said Reverend Michael Davis, a community leader who had reached out after hearing about the incident, "your situation has given a voice to people who thought no one would listen to them. We've had problems with certain officers for years, but when regular citizens complain, nothing happens. Maybe now things will change." Lisa felt the weight of responsibility that came with her unique position. She was a federal agent who had experienced police misconduct firsthand, giving her a perspective that few people in law enforcement could claim. "Reverend Davis, I want you to know that most police officers are good people trying to do a difficult job. But when the bad ones aren't held accountable, it hurts everyone, the community, and the good officers who work hard to build trust." The Federal investigation had also caught the attention of the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. Deputy Assistant Attorney General Catherine Hayes announced that the department would be conducting a comprehensive review of the entire police force's practices and policies. This incident has revealed systemic problems that go beyond one officer's misconduct, Hayes said at a press conference. We will be examining hiring practices, training procedures, complaint investigation protocols, and supervisory oversight. If necessary, we will seek federal oversight of this police department to ensure that civil rights are protected. For Coleman, the legal proceedings moved forward with the relentless efficiency of the federal court system. His attorney had tried to negotiate a plea agreement, but the prosecution's position was firm. The assault on Lisa had been captured, on video, witnessed by civilians and documented by medical professionals. There was no disputing what had happened. The trial lasted only 4 days. The jury saw the security camera footage, heard testimony from the witnesses, and listened to Lisa's professional and measured account of what had occurred. Coleman's defense attorney tried to portray the incident as a momentary lapse in judgment by an otherwise dedicated officer, but the prosecution's evidence of a pattern of misconduct made that argument impossible to sustain. When the jury returned their verdict after just 3 hours of deliberation, Coleman felt his legs give out as he heard the word guilty repeated 3 times, once for each federal charge. Janet sobbed quietly in the gallery while Coleman stared straight ahead, finally understanding that his actions on Oak Street had consequences that would change his life forever. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, giving Coleman time to consider how one afternoon of poor choices and unchecked prejudice had destroyed not just his career, but potentially his freedom, his family's financial security, and his reputation in the community where he'd lived his entire adult life. 6 months after the incident on Oak Street, Coleman stood in a federal courtroom wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed behind his back as Judge Patricia Morgan prepared to deliver his sentence. The courtroom was packed with people whose lives had been touched by this case: community members, police officers, federal agents, and members of both Coleman's and Lisa's families. Judge Morgan had reviewed all the evidence, read the victim impact statements, and considered the pre-sentence reports that painted a complex picture of a man whose career in law enforcement had started with good intentions, but had gradually been corrupted by unchecked prejudices and a system that failed to hold him accountable. "Mr. Coleman," Judge Morgan said, her voice carrying the weight of 20 years on the federal bench, "you took an oath to serve and protect all citizens equally. Instead, you used your position of authority to inflict harm on someone who was cooperating fully with your requests. Your actions that day weren't just a betrayal of Agent Thompson's trust. They were a betrayal of every citizen who depends on law enforcement to treat them with basic human dignity." Coleman's attorney had asked for the minimum sentence, arguing that Coleman was a father of 2 who had lost his career and would never work in law enforcement again. But Judge Morgan had seen too many cases where police misconduct went unpunished to show leniency now. "The court sentences you to 3 years in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release," Judge Morgan announced. "During your supervised release, you are prohibited from seeking employment in any law enforcement capacity and must complete 200 hours of community service focused on civil rights education." Coleman's wife, Janet, buried her face in her hands as the reality of the sentence hit her. 3 years without raised income, 3 years of explaining to their teenage children why their father was in prison, 3 years of carrying the family's financial burden alone. But the criminal case was only the beginning of Coleman's legal troubles. Lisa had filed a comprehensive civil lawsuit against both Coleman personally and the police department, seeking damages for the assault, violation of her civil rights, and the emotional distress caused by the incident. The civil trial took place 2 months after Coleman's sentencing, and it revealed even more disturbing details about the police department's culture of protecting problematic officers. Lisa's attorney, Benjamin Clark, had uncovered internal emails showing that supervisors had been aware of Coleman's issues, but had chosen to transfer him to different districts rather than address his behavior. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Clark said during his closing argument, "this case isn't just about monetary damages. It's about sending a message that law enforcement agencies cannot ignore misconduct and hope it goes away. The police department had multiple opportunities to intervene before Officer Coleman's behavior escalated to physical violence, and they failed every single time. The jury awarded Lisa $1.2 million in damages, $400,000 from Coleman personally, and $800,000 from the police department. For Coleman, already facing financial ruin from legal fees and loss of income, the personal judgment meant he would likely spend the rest of his life paying for those few minutes on Oak Street. Meanwhile, the federal oversight of the police department had begun in earnest. The Department of Justice had appointed a federal monitor, retired Judge Harold Washington, to oversee comprehensive reforms that would transform how the department operated. The changes were sweeping and immediate. Every officer was required to attend 40 hours of additional training on de-escalation techniques, cultural sensitivity, and civil rights law. Body cameras became mandatory for all patrol officers, with strict penalties for officers who failed to activate them during police interactions. Most importantly, the department created an entirely new system for handling misconduct complaints. A civilian oversight board with real investigative power was established, and complaints would now be investigated by independent professionals rather than the officers' colleagues. Lisa found herself at the center of these reform efforts, working with federal officials to develop new training programs that would help officers understand the importance of treating every citizen with respect, regardless of their race, background, or how they were dressed. The goal isn't to make officers afraid to do their jobs, Lisa explained to a group of police recruits during one of her training sessions. The goal is to help you understand that how you treat people during police interactions affects not just that person, but their entire family, their community, and public trust in law enforcement as a whole. One young recruit, Officer Casey Martinez, raised her hand. "Agent Thompson, how do we know when we're letting our own biases affect how we treat people?" Lisa appreciated the honest question. The first step is acknowledging that we all have biases. I have them too. The difference is that when you're wearing a badge and carrying a gun, your biases can have life-changing consequences for other people. You have to constantly check yourself and ask whether you're treating this person the way you'd want your own family member to be treated. The reforms weren't without controversy. Some veteran officers complained that the new oversight made them feel like they were being treated as criminals rather than professionals. Officer Jake Sullivan, a 15-year veteran, expressed frustration during a department meeting. "We're walking on eggshells now," Sullivan said. "Every interaction feels like it's being scrutinized under a microscope. How are we supposed to do police work when we're afraid of being second-guessed for every decision?" Chief Williams, who had managed to keep his job by fully cooperating with the federal investigation, addressed Sullivan's concerns directly. "Jake, I understand your frustration. But the reality is that some officers in this department abused their authority, and that abuse went unchecked for too long. These reforms aren't about making your job harder. They're about making sure we never have another situation like what happened with Coleman." The changes weren't just affecting current officers. The department overhauled its hiring practices, implementing psychological screening that specifically looked for candidates with authoritarian tendencies or racial biases. Background investigations became more thorough, and references from community members where candidates had lived or worked were now required. Training academy curricula were completely redesigned to emphasize community policing and conflict resolution over aggressive enforcement tactics. Recruits now spent as much time learning about civil rights law and cultural sensitivity as they did practicing arrest techniques. 3 years after Coleman's sentencing, the transformation of the police department was remarkable. Complaints against officers had dropped by 60%, not because the complaint process had become more difficult, but because officers were actually treating people better. Community trust in law enforcement, measured through annual surveys, had improved dramatically. Lisa, meanwhile, had been promoted within the FBI and was now leading a national initiative to improve police federal law enforcement cooperation. She traveled around the country, sharing her story and helping other departments implement similar reforms before problems escalated to federal intervention. Coleman was released from federal prison after serving his full 3-year sentence. He had spent his time inside working in the prison library and taking college courses in social work. The experience had given him time to reflect on the choices that had led him there, and the impact his actions had on others. Upon his release, Coleman struggled to find employment. His conviction made him unemployable in law enforcement, and many other employers were reluctant to hire someone with a federal record for civil rights violations. He eventually found work at a nonprofit organization that helped formerly incarcerated individuals reintegrate into society. "I spent 15 years thinking I was a good cop," Coleman said during a presentation to police recruits, part of his court-ordered community service. "But I realize now that being a good cop isn't just about catching criminals or following procedures. It's about treating every person you encounter with dignity and respect, even when they're having the worst day of their life." The young officers, listening to Coleman's presentation, saw a man who had lost everything because of a few minutes of poor judgment and unchecked bias. Some felt sympathy for him, others felt he deserved what happened, but all of them understood that the choices they made in uniform would follow them for the rest of their lives. Lisa's experience had taught her that real change in law enforcement was possible, but it required constant vigilance and a commitment to holding officers accountable when they failed to meet the standards the community deserved. Her assault on Oak Street had been traumatic and unjust, but it had also become a catalyst for reforms that would protect countless other citizens from experiencing similar violations of their rights. The quiet residential street where it all began had returned to normal, but the impact of what happened there continued to ripple through the law enforcement community, serving as a reminder that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that even those who enforce the law must be held accountable when they break it.